Hello, welcome to a new edition of Positionen, which is a subdivision of Projektionen, Kinogespräche, this podcast series I do with Sebastian Seidler. Positionen is one-on-one talking with people we are interested in, and today I have a very special guest, Peter Strickland from England, who I met before at the Braunschweig International Film Festival, and we had a talk on stage there on his films, and in my opinion, we got along very well. So I would like to continue what we began there on some similar topics and probably other topics which were not handled on this first talk. So welcome, Peter Strickland.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. When we met last time at Braunschweig, you kindly gave me this CD here, which is kind of a best of your Sonic Catering Band, which is a kind of experimental music project you started in 1996. And I didn't know this CD when we talked last time, but now I have heard it, obviously, and I see a lot of connections, which we actually talked about, which were experimental English subcultural music from the 80s and 90s, and which refers to kind of this bands featured in the book, England's Hidden Reverse. Do you happen to know that book?
I do have that exact version of the book. He's updated it, but I have that older version. I think 2003 it came out.
Yeah,
David
that's true.
Keenan.
So would you say you're coming from this kind of 80s experimental background? Is that a kind of a source for your inspiration for your artistic work?
Well, with that band, it came from a dream I had, where I just tried to be faithful to that dream. I dreamt I went to see Zobit France perform live, and I had seen Zobit France before. I was a big fan, and they are an 80s, whatever you want to call it, industrial, dark ambient or experimental band.
Yeah.
When I saw them in my dream, they were performing with drinks which had, like Alka-Seltzer or these effervescent pills, and they were mic'd up, and it sounded very heightened and hallucinatory. And I didn't know when I had that dream. I didn't know this had happened before. Maybe not that exact thing, but let me think. Apparently, John Cage was doing it. Pink Floyd were doing it at some point. I think Aphex Twin at some point using a food blender. But I wasn't aware of that. And that dream just triggered something. At that time, I thought it was quite original. But in terms of the structure of what we did, it was very much informed by not just Zobit France, but Nurse with Wound as well. These very jagged cuts that would lead to something completely different. And but in some ways, what we did was the opposite of experimental. It was kind of formulaic, because we would take a recipe. Each time we would work to a recipe, so we were using a score, we were using a formula. So I kind of like the idea. How we structured the sounds from that recipe was very open, but we never performed with pots and pans. What we did was we would cook a meal and document the cooking. So we didn't try and cheat. We would cook a meal, record it, eat the food, and then we would manipulate the raw material. And I think we viewed it as this analogy for cooking. You're taking raw sounds, you're chopping them up, you're mixing them, you're processing them, you're laying them, you're laying them on top of each other. And I think, I was going to say, it escaped me now. It's been so long, but we yeah, it will come back to me. Trying to jog my memory.
So you wouldn't say that this approach, for example, you mentioned Nurse with Wound, which is kind of oral surrealism. And what you do is very to the point. So you use the recipe of food as kind of the composition, and then you restructure it in the mixing, if I understand that
Yes,
correctly.
yes, and it came back to me that the point you made about surrealism.
Mhm.
We were pretty much doing what Duchamp would do. You know, you take something very domestic, very quotidian, you know, something that everyone is familiar with, and all you're doing is shifting the context into something. You're moving the kitchen into a gallery, and by changing that context, it becomes surreal. It becomes the familiar becomes unfamiliar. So that again, that process has been done many times before. Um, um, but yeah, absolutely. You know, we would restructure afterwards after we listen to the recordings, pick out the best moments or the most bizarre moments. And I think what was interesting, I think at the beginning when we started, we were very much in awe of effects units, you know, tape delay and reverb and all kinds of stuff, flanges perhaps, wah wah pedals. So the temptation at the beginning was to drown these source sounds in effects, and I think later on, I think when our confidence developed, we didn't feel we needed to hide behind effects. We could let the sounds exist as they are, and that also came about through people I knew. So I got to know Steve Stapleton from Nurse. I was a fan. I used to write to him, and he would recommend music to listen to. People like Alvin Lucia, Robert Ashley. I got to know another guy in Hungary called Paul Toth, who was he played one of the Foley artists in Bavarian Sound Studio. I used to share a flat with him, and he was a big Francisco Lopez fan. And again, Francisco Lopez would play. He would a lot of his recordings were very exposed. You know, they were not using so many effects. It was all about the positioning, the stereo mix, the context. So I think our later stuff became so there were all kinds of changes within the band. You know, I think starting with analog and tape, then moving to Cubase, which became quite clinical,
Mhm.
and then later becoming much more at ease with just letting sounds exist.
Yeah, I have the feeling that people started working with Cubase and were very tempted to get into a really electronic music, which became more easy to the ear. And so some of them moved in other directions to get this very the more difficult sound again. And it's very interesting because, as you mentioned it, yeah, on this CD, I realized you actually hear some of the sources and you can identify them, but they still make sense within the whole framework of the sound. And you forget it again then. But that's interesting because I realized that you do not camouflage the sounds with effects. That's what you meant.
Yeah, I mean, on that one, I try to pick my favorite tracks, which are not so not they're not drenched in effects so
Mhm.
much, but my earlier stuff was very effects heavy. I avoided most of the Cubase stuff we did. I mean, as you said, I think around the mid '90s, Cubase was a very exciting thing. A lot of bands could do these micro edits, which would be harder on tape. And I think a lot of the music that was coming out around that time, especially on Warp. That was really exciting. It was a great period. And we co-bought our first computer in 1997. It was a very exciting thing. We bought our first Mac. We'd never had a computer before, and we got Cubase, and we kind of veered more towards rhythm and trying this thing. I think a lot of it was also to do with my social life as well. I moved to London, kind of music I was listening to, and the gigs I was going to. And then I moved to Hungary. Again, a lot of the company I was keeping, people were into, you know, people like again Robert Ashley or David Tudor. So it was a very different atmosphere. when I moved to Hungary. Much more prolonged pieces, much more barren. But yeah, I think there was so yeah we had these kind of different periods which were very much influenced by social situations or the music I was listening to, and I should also add in the other band members as well. I mean, it
Hmm.
wasn't just me; we were very much a unit. We would learn from each other. So it was mostly Colin Fletcher and Tim Kirby, but there are many other band members who came in and out, like Dan Hayhurst. And actually, there's a guy who lives in Berlin now. He was part of the band at one point. He's called Zsolt Surej. He's very active in Berlin. He's
Hmm.
Hungarian. He moved to Berlin.
Yeah, Berlin has a very vivid experimental music scene anyway, so it's still interesting to be there actually. Yeah. And each time I'm in Berlin, I see a lot of interesting concerts and performances. So it's happening again.
Actually,
Um,
he's a member of Faust. I don't know which
mhm,
version of Faust. There's so many versions of
mhm.
Faust now, but he was initially in with Zappi and John Jaime Perron, but I don't know. I know they went their separate ways. But yeah, so Jolt's very very busy with various.
Mhm. When we return to the beginnings of this London music scene, which we talked about, it came from the Throbbing Gristle Industrial Records background and developed in different directions, I would say. There's this branch of Coil, for example, which went into more electronic stuff and like dark electronic technoid stuff. And then there is this surreal context connected with Nurse's Wound and the noisy background with bands like White House, for example. And there's a fourth version, which I would say is the occult direction, which Current 93 began. And then it's developed in its own right, in a way. Have you ever been interested in that part of the musical context?
You mean the occult?
Yeah, the cult, yeah.
Not really. No, no.
Mhm.
There's a lot of current 93 I love,
Okay.
but I just had no interest in that side of them. I was
Hmm.
more into for the sonic direction they were going in, which was
Hmm.
really extraordinary sometimes. I mean, again, I think Current 93 had so many phases. They had this more stripped down phase towards the mid 90s. But the early stuff, like Nature Unveiled,
Yeah.
Dog's Blood Rising, just incredible.
But that was uh, I would say it's the most interesting musically, most interesting phase in the beginning, but at the same time, it's a very harsh occult context. Yeah.
Yeah, and again, obviously, I was aware that that was a kind of a force within the music, but that's just something I never really
Mm.
it just wasn't really within my interests. My interests were much more prosaic, shall I say. I was
Hmm.
much more into the texture of
Hmm.
how things sounded. I was into you know the psychedelic side of things. I was very much interested in, but when it comes to the occult or folk, all this
Hmm.
stuff, it's just not my cup of tea. It's not because I don't dismiss it. It's just not for me.
Hmm.
So again, there's a huge wave or even fashion now for folk horror.
Hmm. Absolutely, yeah.
It's not, I mean, fair enough. I have nothing against it at all. It just doesn't particularly interest me.
There's this compilation film, The Field Guide to Evil.
Yeah, that's
Wouldn't you
kind of
say that this is a kind of connection to that background?
yeah, but again, I was asked to do something, and you kind of, if someone offers you a chance to make a film, you look at the budget, you look at the whole situation. Is it possible? And there was a chance for me to do something, but again, I wasn't really, I mean, yeah,
Hmm.
it was a folk tale, but it
Right.
didn't really trigger. the normal associations within that. I was much more interested in fetishism and revenge, if you could call it that. So yeah, I mean, I think again, there's some folk horror films I really love. There's a new one, which I don't know if you can call it folk horror. It's Ennis Main by Mark Jenkin. I really love that. It's that came out about a month ago, I think. That was extraordinary. You know, the older folk horror films, such as the Wicker Man, Blood on Satan's Claw. So yeah, they're individual films I really love, but as a genre, I don't. But to be honest, there are not many genres I love as such. I mean, even Giallo. I mean, there's some great Giallo films, but
Yeah.
It's odd because I made a film that was set in a Giallo type of studio, and the offers I still get now are all in that kind of world. No one offers me a romance. I did a romance with the Duke of Burgundy, but no one ever offers me a romance film.
The thing is, Barbarian Sound Studio is the Giallo-related film, and Duke of Burgundy is your romance, which is actually a kind of sadomasochistic romance, to be precise, which is kind of interesting in that context, because it's not Giallo-related in any aspect, but but Giallo is also sadomasochistic most of the time in its depiction of relationships and violence, sexualized violence in a way. But the funny thing is, as you mentioned it, Barbarian Sound Studio is kind of viewing a Giallo from the opposite of the screen, like showing everything which is going on besides the things on the screen.
Yes, and it also takes in general Italian horror. So you would argue that actually the film within the film is more in the vein of it's a complete rip-off of Argento's Suspiria, which is not technically a Giallo film. But you know, I'm there's a mixture of everything really. You know, there's the various signposts to Giallo, signposts to the more supernatural stuff. But again, my concern was very much in the nuts and bolts, the mechanics, the texture. I was much more focused on this. And that's kind of what I've always been focused on. Obviously, the emotional sphere is something I find interesting. And I think without that, it becomes very surface. But I think how I kind of travel to that core of emotion is usually done through these obsessive elements of texture and surface, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I would say your cinema is marked by a domination of form, which becomes the content and substance of the films. I totally agree that, for example, Duke of Burgundy is a very emotional film, but it's emotional via the form it develops.
Yeah, and the interesting thing about sadomasochistic rituals is they do follow that structure in a sense. So in a way, it was a perfect film to play with the form, the repetition, the performance element. It was in a way, it was just a perfect way to play with both form and the idea of the dynamics within a sadomasochistic relationship, especially when one person is a reluctant dominer.
I would like to talk about your tendency to create darkness within your films, because you said you're not interested in the occult. I totally agree. It's not in your films, but in your films, there is a lot of basic darkness. It begins with the first long feature, Katalin Varga, and I'm very fascinated by those scenes of passage where you see people moving through the landscape and you have this really dark sounds. And then Bavarian Sound Studio obviously is about creating dark sounds. And then Duke of Burgundy has this very dreamlike psychedelic atmosphere, but it has kind of a gothic edge if you see it not in a very specific, but in the context of creating darkness and ritualistic darkness in a way. And the same you could say for In Fabric and probably for Flux Gourmet. Would you relate to that?
I would, yeah. Again, the darkness comes from, I think, in a general sense, it comes from a sense of the romantic, not in the sense of love, but if you think of the romantic painters, Gothic architecture, Gothic music, that always embraced a sense of darkness, a sense of the sublime, perhaps. So I mean, Gothic is something I do that has informed my work, and a lot of the bands we spoke about earlier, kind of, you could, in some ways, you could view them as Gothic, like Current 93, Nurse with Wood. But I was a huge fan of the more mainstream bands such as Bauhaus, The Cure, Sisters, the early Sisters of Mercy. Like the first album was extraordinary.
For sure.
So yeah, I think it has informed the atmosphere has informed my work, but I think you try to be true to. I think it depends what comes first, really, but you try to serve the story. And I think Kotlinwager, it's such a dark subject that it suited that whole atmosphere, really. How to give it this Gothic feeling. And also, I think, a sense of how to do it responsibly. It's a very, very serious subject, which is why I kind of decided not to show the attack. It just didn't. I don't have an issue with other filmmakers showing the attack. I think there's some great films that have been made that have done that, but there's always a danger. For me personally, I thought there was a danger of titillation, which I didn't want. It just didn't feel. It felt like it would go against what the film was trying to achieve. But in terms of the actual music, I mean, I heard that piece it was from a David Tibet, Stephen Stapleton album called The Sadness of Things.
Oh yeah.
And it's not actually Tibet on that piece. It's Steve Stapleton and Jeff Cox. And I was on a train to Romania. I think I'm trying to go back a bit now. No, that's not true. I'd been to Romania, but it wasn't there. But anyway, that piece of music was very long. I think it was about over 20 minutes.
Yeah,
it reminded me
one side of the album. Yeah.
Yeah, it reminded me so much of Popol Vuh's music to Herzog's Nosferatu. And I wrote to Steve Stapleton and I asked his permission to use the music. I hadn't written the script at that point. I just wanted to know if I could write to that, and he said yes. And that was the one film that really came out of music. Listening to that piece of music again and again, and your brain just goes to those places, really. It informed so much.
For me, that makes absolute sense because I spent my youth in the 80s always running around with a Walkman, as you said back then, and was listening to this kind of music like Coil, Current 93, and so on. So I can relate because it changes your reception of reality in a very special way, and so you begin recepting reality as kind of a dream reality or parallel reality, and then it inspires you in a certain way. And so for me, it also makes sense is that you don't get too explicit in Katalin Varga, which is kind of a rape revenge film, basically.
It is, yeah.
But it has this kind of very negative spiritual aspect, negative not let me explain, kind of destructive human aspect in the atmosphere, which is probably could be damaged by being too explicit. Is that what you meant?
Yeah, in some ways, yeah. Um, I think I also wanted, but there's something else. I wanted the audience to kind of learn again how to be shocked, because I think everyone's so used to images of sexual assault. It's always unpleasant, of course it is. But it's an element of, you feel some people have been numbed to it. And I think by taking that away and you're only giving words, in a way, it's much more confrontational. It activates the mind a lot more. When I wrote it, there was a lot of, I was showing it to friends. There was a lot of criticism. Oh, it's just a talking head. We don't do talking heads. That's really out of fashion to do a talking head. And it is a talking head. It's a long sequence. And even when we shot the film, the crew, they were just saying, "Why are we doing this? This is boring." And and poor Hilda, who was doing it, she was getting really put off by these criticisms. But I don't know. I mean, sometimes I'm the first to admit I get many things wrong, but I had a hunch this could work. This would not bore the audience. It would draw them in. And a lot of it is to do with Hilda, of course. It's her performance, which is so intense. But in a way, it was to make it more shocking, actually.
Yeah.
And you can't escape her. She's looking at you. Her face is there. There's no you can't put your head down. She's there looking you in the eye, pretty much.
I was somehow reminded, and you probably don't agree here, but I was somehow reminded of certain scenes from Tarkovsky films, also because Tarkovsky has this idea of creating landscapes on the sound and the image level at the same time, and then confronting you with people like talking into your face. And like in Stalker and in The Mirror, for example. Can you relate to that, or?
I can. I was a huge Tarkovsky fan. And I remember, I think strangely, what I remember the most from Stalker is those shots of the water with, I think that's an image of like an Orthodox icon painting in
Yeah,
the
it's
water.
an icon. Yeah.
Yeah, and just all this, the dirt, the detritus. So yeah, his way of almost finding the divine in natural elements was something very, very powerful for me. And it's kind of interesting, I think later on I discovered Bela Tarr, who again would focus on natural elements, but in a very, very ungodly manner. It was very much profane. It was very much to do with the earth. There's no God. That was my impression of it. Whereas Tarkovsky was, there always this sense of there is a God, even if the God is judgmental or not fair, but still there was an element. So I think in Cotton Varga, it is she's a Catholic woman. There was this sense of, in a way, it's a ballad. It's she doesn't. There's no justice in the film, but there's sadly that is life. I'm kind of going away from your question, but
that's still interesting.
But no, Tarkovsky, absolutely. I think he was a huge influence on me. Especially films such as Stalker, Solaris, Mirror. I think those three, especially.
Yeah, I would totally agree to that. Yeah. For me as well. And I think that's interesting because he's struggling with this idea, what I called very like, probably it's not the right word, but it's kind of a spiritual dimension he sees there, but he questions it at the same time. And it's different with Bela Tarr, as you said, that's true. But I think with Tarkovsky, there's an ambivalence. And I see this kind of ambivalence in your first film.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, you put it a lot better than I could. But yeah, I think having this ambivalence towards this spiritual dimension. I mean, that is the way to say it. There is this calling for again, I'm no good at finding these words. That's kind of why I make films, because I can't put these things in.
Yeah,
in,
that's totally legit.
um,
And we have your films.
yeah, you have the films at least. So yeah, it is. It's interesting. I was called a misogynist for that film. I kind of understand why I was called that. But just because a woman is killed in my film, it doesn't mean I support that. Of course, I don't.
Yeah, sure.
And I think in a way we have enough films where there's a happy ending, where there's justice. But I think in a way, for so many people in life who have been victims of crime and injustice, whether that's state injustice or to do with something, with individuals. Probably, I don't know the percentages, but a huge number of people don't find justice, and I think there's something cathartic when you can see that in a film, that okay,
Mm.
someone recognizes that there isn't justice. I think there is the kind of therapy in that. That a lot of people, the police, they're not going to give a shit about you sometimes. I'm not saying all the time, but all the police will attack you. So I think that there was a voice for that. Um, so yeah, if someone calls me misogynist, then whatever. But
Mm.
uh,
But
that's where the film was coming from.
it's a funny thing because for Duke of Burgundy, you could actually be called a feminist filmmaker. I wouldn't say that because I think it's not what the film really is about, but
No,
one could say that.
no, I mean, no, I will rephrase that. I don't see myself as a misogynist or a feminist when I make films. It doesn't mean I'm anti-feminist either. I just feel it's just I'm just kind of making films about humans, really. I have to love most of my characters. The nature of making a film is you put your characters through a very difficult time most of the time. But yeah, it is weird. I have been called either a misogynist or a feminist, depending on who sees the film. I don't really. I Yeah, in terms of the films, I don't really subscribe to that. Regarding feminism, I absolutely do agree with it, but I don't really. I think the films I make are much messier. If I look at Flux Gourmet,
Yeah,
you have a feminist speech,
yeah.
but by a woman who has quite patriarchal traits. And again, that's not me making a statement. I'm just looking at one character. My films can't really go beyond the characters.
I realized that in most of your films, there is one character which is portrayed in a very human way. You can really relate to this person. And then there are a lot of characters which are more sketchy or kind of principal characters, which represent ideas. Is Do you understand what I'm talking
Yeah, I
about?
mean,
Of
Greenaway
like,
was doing.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's again, it's a fine line, because I think ultimately characters and emotions and dilemmas is something that really drives me. But I kind of see what you mean. I think Greenaway was a huge influence in terms of it was a cinema of ideas, and the
Mhm.
characters could be allegorical sometimes, or ciphers. Ciphers to explore something. So I'm trying to think of examples. Have I done that? I might have done that. I can't think at the moment. Um,
In Flex Gourmet, for example, there is the critic who is really relatable because of his digestion problems and all these things. And so he's can be recepted in a very close, intimate way, probably, and you feel for him. And there's the group of artists which are more abstract, in my reception at least.
yeah, I think part of that was because obviously that film could be. mistaken as autobiographical. So I didn't want to. I wanted to have a distance between myself and the band members, and also make them very contradictory, very annoying, very narcissistic in a way, so you don't know which side I'm on. That was kind of interesting for me because again, it's looking at, of course, it's predominantly about looking at the stomach and all the tricks it plays on human beings, but I was looking at art funding as well, and I didn't. Again, I think it's a similar thing to the Duke of Burgundy. I didn't want the audience to know which side I'm taking.
Mm-hmm.
Am I on the submissive side? Am I on the dominant side? Or I'm just looking at characters who are incompatible, and that goes for Flux Gourmet as well. So yeah, I think it goes back to the comment about feminism, where I think what I'm scared of. I'm not scared of feminism at all. I think what I'm scared of is sloganeering. That's what I should have said earlier. I think when a film becomes a slogan, that's something I'm a bit wary of.
To bring this even further, would you say that films like Duke of Burgundy and Flux Gourmet could be considered queer cinema?
I think like all these things is not for me to say. I mean, again, what I should clarify: if somebody calls my work feminist or even misogynist, perhaps actually, I mean, if they call it anything, it's not for me to say.
Yeah.
I can see why you could say queer cinema, especially the Duke of Burgundy. It's played in many queer festivals.
Sure.
I mean, I should also add that some critics for queer newspapers have absolutely what's the word destroyed the film. So I'm very open to a queer interpretation and embracing of that within queer culture. Again, I wouldn't personally put it in that box because it's not for me to do that. It's the same thing like I wouldn't call it's like cult cinema. I wouldn't call my film cult. I wouldn't call it anything. I'd call it a romance, but yeah. But there's certain things. It's not for the filmmaker to say. It's not for me to say cult. It's not for me to say it's feminist. It's not for me to say it's queer. It's my duty is to make the film. I tend to look at the emotions. So yeah, I view it as a romance. Of course, it has, it's a sadomaso film, and I'm very happy if it ends up if it's embraced by sadomasochistic culture. I'm fine with that bit. I'm not the one to go to sell it as that, really.
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting because some of your films seem to get along really well with certain categories, like a Barbarian Sound Studio is clearly a meta giallo. It's a film about making a giallo or a gothic horror film, Italian gothic film, in a certain age. But there's still more to that film. That's what you're talking about probably when you say for you, it's probably something different. As I understand it. And in Fabric, for example, can clearly be seen as a ghost horror, gothic horror film, but at the same time, it's about the mechanisms of horror and the uncanny and anything. But I would still argue that in Fabric, for example, is the closest to any genre film you ever made.
That's true. No, that is true. Absolutely. Yeah. I just wanted to make I mean, technically, you can't really call it a ghost because the object is not really a ghost. But what would you call it? Supernatural, perhaps? Uncanny, as you said. But I love those old ghost television specials the BBC used to do. The M.R. James. Yeah. That was really what I wanted to explore. I just wondered if you took that M.R. James atmosphere or sensibility, took it away from the haunted beach, took it away from the haunted country house, took it to a very unhaunted space, which is the high street, where all the shopping plazas. Can you, if you really focus on it, can you make a very prosaic space, very haunted. So I was just trying to look back at my time working in retail. When you work,
Traumatizing, as you told
yes,
us.
but certain things which were a bit creepy. I think if you're working in January when they have, I don't know, you have this. Do you have this in Germany? The January sales when everything is very cheap.
Yeah, it's like post-Christmas sale in a way. Yeah,
Yeah, the
yeah,
Christmas sales, and you have queues and queues of people in 5 o'clock in the
yeah.
morning, and it's something quite eerie when you look out the window and you're working early in the morning, and you see these queues of people in the darkness. It's something quite interesting about it. Even the sound of the street. And I think with Martin Pavey, when we did the sound mix, I asked Martin if we could get a library recording of the High Street from the 70s, not to go out, because usually we go out ourselves and record something. We were usually anti-library. We always try to do original sound,
Yeah.
or at least ask someone who did original sound. People like Alan Burbage, who has these nature recordings, he does. But with that one, we really wanted an archive library recording of the High Street in the 1970s. Because again, the tapes were usually quarter-inch tapes, so the bandwidth sounds thinner. It sounds creepier. There's something quite interesting when it's an archive. It gives it that ghostliness, which we really wanted.
Mhm.
And again, the sense that the High Street is becoming a ghostly space. People are in my neighborhood. There's an Amazon truck every 5 minutes. People.
Yeah.
Um, even school uniforms in England, people have to order them online most of the time. So the High Street is becoming a kind of a deserted space.
A film like In Fabric has a certain atmosphere which I connect with my many visits to London in the 80s and 90s. And because it's still different than in Germany, for example. And so I sense a certain atmosphere, but I cannot really specify that. Also, all your films, which are not filmed actually, some of them are not even filmed in England, but they have this certain atmosphere I connect with London. I don't know why that is. I just say
Mm.
that.
I used to live in London. I lived there for 2 years. Yeah, I don't know. I just being British, perhaps. I'm not sure. Well, I'm half Greek actually, but still, I grew up in Britain. I never lived in Greece.
I think socialization is the most important factor here. So you inhaled the Britishness in a way that it shows in your films, probably, and that's very fascinating to me because London has always been a place of longing for me and a very mysterious place. Which is funny when you live there probably, but if you visit there, and I've been there a lot of times during the 90s to go to the Torture Garden, for example, and I really experienced this certain subcultural club scene and fetish scene and so on, and I went shopping there in Soho and so on, and a lot of those books and records I still have from that time, and so it's very much connected with that, and it shows in your films. It comes up here and there, and even if Flux Gourmet is a film, it plays in a rural villa, but it has this very British subcultural drive, which is very fascinating to me.
Well, all that is very much, it always was underground, but it's even more underground now because a lot of those spaces you mentioned, I mean, I don't know if Torture Garden is still going, but
I
in terms
think,
of
yeah,
shop,
it is.
okay, but in
And
terms of
especially
shop,
it's also now in Berlin and worldwide, and driven by the same people.
franchise.
Yeah, and it's a French.
But in terms of shops, they really are dying out, and they were social spaces. You would meet
Yeah,
people, um, whether it's subculture clothing, whether it's record stores, bookstores. There was a great one in Camden called Compendium.
yeah,
Um, you would you could get really underground stuff there.
right.
So yeah, I don't know. It's there was a big social element to those places. You could get advice from someone working there. Sometimes you get people who
Oh
are
yeah,
really,
sure.
really snobbish and would kind of laugh at you asked the wrong question. But other times it was incredible. I remember asking about when I first got into Bach, and I wanted help finding the right version of the St. Matthew Passion. And the woman working there, she just taught me through every conductor, every version, from very old ones to very modern ones. And eventually she played me the Karl Richter version from the 50s on Deutsche Grammophon, which sounded incredible. And just to have someone talk you through the different ways a conductor would work through it, you can't get that when you order online.
Yeah, that's something which is absolutely missing, because I remember when I was there for the first time in my early 20s, or around 20 probably, I just went to Soho shops, like bookshops and even sex shops, and I met people there who happened to be musicians in the subculture context. And so I think Simon Norris was working there from Cyclope, and Steve Thor was connected to that, and those bookshops had stuff which you wouldn't find anywhere now. And so you mentioned in other interviews that you are influenced by cinema of transgression of the 80s, and there were the books by Richard Kern and so on, and Nick Said, and all these publications, which is totally missing. So it's gone for newer and younger audiences, and they don't care in any way about these things.
Well, I used to know Nick Zed. I did one of my first narrative films with Nick, Nick and Holly Woodlawn from
Mm-hmm.
Morrissey's Trash. Nick was pretty much the first person I knew who was into film. When I say film, as in beyond watching Spielberg, which I do love, by the way. So I have nothing against Spielberg at all. But in terms of wanting something else on top of Spielberg, when it came to Tony Conrad's films or Shirley Clark, so that was an extraordinary time. And I think through Nick, I met Tessa Hughes Freeland. She was a great filmmaker, a great mind. She just did these pieces of John Zorn and Ella
Mm-hmm.
Troiano, sorry. The Filmmakers Co-op, Sarah, she used to work there. Very supportive. So I first went to America when I was 21. Yeah. And I stayed with my Greek aunt in Queens, in Woodhaven. I get the J train to, the Filmmakers Co-op. Johannes Schoenherr was
Mm-hmm.
hanging out there. And he knew everyone. He knew Todd Phillips
Yeah.
way before, the Joker, and he knew Kern, all those people. So really that was a very, putting the films to one side, in terms of those people, they were very inspiring for me. Obviously the films themselves, I haven't seen them in a while. I imagine, I don't know how they work now.
Yes, there's still a document of how it worked at that time. Mm.
Yeah, and I think Lydia Lunch, I think she, again, I never knew her, so I can't speak on her behalf, but um, you could argue that some of Kern's films were, we talk about the male gaze and so on, but I think there were very much collaborations with him and Lydia Lunch, and I think so
Yeah,
much
sure.
working through trauma, whether that was autobiographical or not, I have no idea. But you could tell there was something much deeper
Mhm.
being worked through in those films, such as I think especially Fingered, the is it the right side of my brain as well.
It's a funny thing, because I invited Jack Sargent, the author of Death Tripping, the Cinema of Transgression, the book about this time and all these films. And he showed some of the Richard Kern films to my students, I think like 10 years ago. And it was really like they found them strange, and they didn't know how to handle it. And that's it. They were not even shocked by them, but just they found them strange.
Well,
So
I think
this time might be gone.
yeah. Well, for me, yeah, I think when it comes to shock value, I can kind of take it or leave it. I think what I got from Kern, what I got from White House as well, was not that. It was this energy that was extraordinary, this strangeness. And I think the Kern films, the way he uses butthole surfers and stuff like that. Um, and again, if I think of the early White House albums, I can kind of, I don't key into the more shocking elements. It is the atmosphere. which is kind of unparalleled. So yeah, I mean, there are films and music I love, which you could argue are very problematic. I think I can understand why someone would say that, but um, it doesn't mean when you are keying into those aspects. You know, if I think of a film such as I think it's Sean Costello's Water Power, which is an extremely unpleasant film.
Yeah.
But I see it like a nightmare. I don't see it. You know, certainly, there's nothing to enjoy in that film. But if
No.
you view Jamie Gillis's orgasm the same way as you would an Edvard Munch painting,
Yeah.
or, I'm not sure how you pronounce his name. I see it as a Texas Chainsaw Massacre of porn. You know, it is a nightmare. The way it's edited, the music he uses, the grain, the grit of that 16 mil, the fact
I can
when he
relate to
knew
that.
they're
That's
all
true.
high, they're filming it. It's something very what's the word? Deranged. That energy. So I think energy has a lot to do with these things. You know, the energy you get off a film. Whether I disagree with the sexual politics. You know, they're horrendous in that film. Of course they are. But there is an energy there which was quite inspiring. If I'm
Mhm.
brutally
That's very interesting. I can totally relate to that because, I mean, I've seen that film and had very similar feelings about it. And it's really nightmarish in a very intense way, which isn't captured during films of the last 20 years, probably 30 years. So it's very much placed in a certain context, which was very aggressive and very inspiring in this aggressive way, probably. So many people around 50, I would say, are looking back to the 70s films because of this intensity and this the will to go beyond certain lines to achieve these things. And you couldn't do that now, probably.
Well, yeah, I don't know. I'm trying to work out what it is because I'm sure there are films now which have that. I don't have the need to watch them.
Hmm.
And maybe it's because of the mythology of New York, 42nd Street. It's so much of it to do. It could be to do with that. The Again, the texture. I'm obsessed with texture. So if a film is shot on digital, some horror film, I just don't feel any curiosity to watch it. That
Yeah.
might be my failing. I could be missing something amazing, but um, so in a way, my taste is quite limited. I just tend to watch 70s films.
That's what I meant.
Yeah. But yeah, again, you know, actually, I don't like horror, to be honest. I
Hmm.
don't like seeing people suffering. I don't get any enjoyment from that. It just so happens the films that were the most imaginative, the most manic, the most poetic in a way, tended to just be full of sexual horror. That's it.
Yeah.
But I don't. No. Normally, that's the thing. When I get offered, I'm sent horror scripts, and I just don't like it. I don't. That's just my personal taste. I was looking for other things
Hmm.
within those films.
Yeah, the poetic quality, and you work on this level in your own films, even if they are related to the genre. And that's what we actually talked about in Braunschweig Film Festival. And this talk is also online on YouTube. So you will find it, Braunschweig, Peter Strickland, Markus Stiglegger, you will find our talk there. One last question.
Oh, sorry. Just one last example is a
Yeah,
really good be a Razorhead, where
yeah.
there's nothing pleasant about seeing a father kill his baby. But that's just one facet of the film. The atmosphere was so inspiring, so evocative, so romantic. Again, in the sense of romantic painting. That's why I come back to Eraserhead, not because of what happens in the film. I
Mhm.
don't really. I kind of almost turn a blind eye to what is happening in the film. It's everything else: the sound, the forefronting of sounds you'd normally have in the background. You know, this just a whole industrial soundscape. That's what I come back to. Yeah, not the actual content.
Mm-hmm. There's one title in your filmography I'm curious about, very shortly probably. How did it come about? You filmed Björk actually live.
Oh yeah. Excuse me, sorry. I was asked, simple as that. I was a fan. I mean, I loved, especially, is it Vespertine? Is that how you pronounce it? Is it her third album? I think it's her third solo album. Yeah, it came out in 2001. So, and also I knew she had a background to do with bands such as Crass, Current 93. She was into just, musicians such as Pansonic, Stockhausen. So it was something that I was very keen. I was very keen to meet her and talk. We got on quite well, or at least I thought. I mean, I had reservations at the beginning because I'd always done my own thing. I'd never worked with someone else before, and I think it was very much it is a job. It's a concert film. You can't disguise that. I was going to co-direct it as well. That scared me as well with Nick Fenton.
Yeah, I've seen that. Yeah,
I'm very much used to doing things on my own. So I came in being a little bit scared, and I heard, well, I don't know. I was a bit cautious. But actually, it was a great job. I loved working with Björk. I loved working with Nick. It was the most frictionless job I've ever done. No arguments, which is usually my films are arguments, sadly. So yeah, I enjoyed it. I mean, it's her vision. It's not my vision. She asked me to contribute certain ideas, and Nick had ideas. But you are servicing her vision, which I'm fine with. I'm absolutely fine with that. And actually, it was actually quite liberating, because when you're doing your thing only, you do get into arguments because someone's always trying to influence that, and I think it can get very it can get unhealthy sometimes. So it was nice to step back from my own head, and actually it was just very, very pleasant to do something for someone else. And yeah, I mean, again, a concert film is a concert film. We try to introduce elements which were a bit unusual, like using stock footage and superimpositions. Nick had some great ideas, in terms of.
And there are projections on her and so on.
Yeah. So, but yeah, it was just a very pleasant experience for me. And just, it opened me up to collaboration a lot more, actually. So I think now I realize that my films can't, you cannot live off the kind of films I make. I mean, it's just impossible. So I needed to find other work. And I think that gave me a taste for, well, actually, I can write for other people. I don't mind. So when I write for other people, it's very much I do what they ask me to do, and I have no issue with it at all. So yeah, there was a nice period in my life, absolutely.
And 2014, that was around the Duke of Burgundy, as I see.
We actually shot it, I think, a week before we started pre-production on the Duke of Burgundy. The timing was a little bit tricky. And the editing was done concurrently. So Nick did a lot of editing by himself on the Björk thing. I mean, the actual core concert footage, he pretty much did that by himself. So yeah, I mean, he definitely deserves his co-directing credit. A great editor as well. I mean, he edits other films by Richard A. Hardy, Anton Corbin. So I love Nick. He's great.
Thank you very much. I would encourage our listeners to search out the live video of Björk's concert filmed by Peter Strickland online. It's on YouTube, as I saw it online.
It's on YouTube now. Okay.
Yeah, I think so. Even probably an excerpt, not the whole concert.
Oh, okay, all right.
And the films, I mean, Barbarian Sound Studio, you can get in Germany. Duke of Burgundy is out on DVD, and In Fabric is out by Play on Pictures, actually on Blu-ray. but it's not possible to get Flux Gourmet in Germany. You have to order it from Great Britain, where it is out on Blu-ray, and you definitely have to do that. That's to our listeners, because I think the films by Peter Strickland are really remarkable and unique. And I hope you enjoyed our talk, which was more about the background, the subcultural context, the music and sound aspects. But Peter, I hope you enjoyed our talk in a way.
Yes, yes. I got myself in a muddle sometimes with all these things, but it's no, I enjoyed it. Thank you. Yeah.
And I hope to talk to you sometimes in the future and to see more of your work.
I hope. Let's see. I hope. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.